I'm Troy Van Voris. I'm a chemist at MIT, and I work on quantum mechanics and renewable energy and chemistry. And I think that God understands science better than I do.
Troy, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. You're a professor of chemistry at MIT, but you don't really work in the lab, at least as we would traditionally think of a chemist with beakers and mixing chemicals. So can you talk a little bit about your journey to theoretical chemistry?
Yeah, so there were, of course, two things. There was a push and a pull. So the push is that I was not very good at working with beakers and chemicals, which sort of was a hint that maybe experimental chemistry wasn't what I should do. And then I really enjoyed the virtual world of ones and zeros, of trying to make models and make predictions based off of those things. And the models had a smaller tendency to explode than the actual chemistry. And so I thought that was really a good fit for me.
So did you, as a high school student, did you know that you wanted to go into chemistry as a profession? At what point did that
Yeah, I decided on chemistry towards the end of undergrad. I mean, I was interested in chemistry. I was also interested in math. I was also interested in theater. So I had lots of things I was interested in. But towards the end of undergrad, I decided that chemistry was really the right fit for me.
So why, you were wrestling through a diversity of interests, why did you end up choosing chemistry versus, say, theater?
Yeah, the thing I like about chemistry is that everything that we learn builds on itself. So, I learned something today, and then I learned something tomorrow that builds on what I learned yesterday, and then I learned something that builds on that the next day. And so, at the start, sometimes it seems unclear about what you want to do, but in hindsight, you realize, okay, that's really the thing that I like, is that, going back and having the retrospective look of saying, look how far we have come from where it started.
So is there anything particularly about that building on and the process of discovering theoretical chemistry that sort of still captures your imagination and you find beautiful?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that captured my imagination, even before I knew for sure I was going to be a chemist, the thing that captured my imagination about chemistry, and particularly the sort of physical models of chemistry, was just that there's this sort of world of invisible atoms and molecules that make up everything we see, and those things behave in ways that I don't usually understand well. Which is that, my hand seems like a solid object, and so I'm shocked to find that my hand is actually 99% empty space. Or I might lean against a wall for support, and that wall seems to be standing perfectly still, and so it's shocking for me to find that wall is actually composed of particles that are moving millions of miles an hour relative to one another. And that these individual particles that seem very stationary and stable could actually move from point A to point B without apparently passing between some of the points in between, through some of the points in between. And that sort of mysterious quality of things was always what drew me to chemistry in the first place, and it's those mysteries that still keep me excited now.
So for me personally, my day-to-day experience with chemistry is making coffee in the morning, right?
Yes.
So can you share a little bit about some of the most recent discoveries in your field, and why should I care about that as I'm drinking my morning coffee?
Yeah. So one of the biggest challenges that we're facing as a human race is that there's more and more and more people. Every day, there's more people than there were the day before.
Funny how that works. We just keep making more people.
We just keep, and it's the success of the human enterprise. It didn't used to be the case. People used to die about as often as they were born, and so the population sort of stayed steady. But we've gotten good at curing diseases, extending lifespans, and that's all wonderful. But it means that we have this burgeoning problem of an ever-growing population. And so there's the difficulty of saying, well, how do we make sure that there's always enough? Enough food, enough water, enough energy, enough things to keep people's quality of life good, so that the Earth doesn't turn into a dystopian young adult novel.
We're trying to avoid dystopian young adult novels.
Yeah, and chemistry is the way that we do that. Chemistry is the way that we transform one thing into another. How we drive, food production and consumption, how we purify water, how we use energy to run these transformations. And this sort of sustainability drive is currently one of the biggest things that chemistry is pushing towards, is trying to figure out, well, we know how to do these things. How can we do them in ways that are sustainable?
So basically, you're saying I should care because I want to avoid living through the Hunger Games is why.
Exactly,
is why I care about
exactly.
chemistry.
Yes, we don't want the Hunger Games. We
love it.
want something different.
Are there some recent discoveries in your field, and maybe the ones that you've been working on, that you find encouraging as progress towards preventing that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I work on a lot is renewable energy. So trying to make sure that there's enough energy for people. One thing we've made a lot of progress on recently is the availability of solar energy. So the price of solar panels, if you haven't investigated putting solar panels on your house, I recommend that you do, because the price of solar panels has dropped significantly. Which means that there's now a huge amount of solar electricity that's available. And one of the things one thing is that chemistry has played a huge role in this. So the solar panels that are on your roof, that would be on your roof, they're warranted for a certain amount of time because we've learned how to protect them from degradation for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, so that even after a very long time they still work. And that's actually a success of materials chemistry. But then moving beyond that, we have to ask the question, well, we're now getting to the other side of the coin where we've got so much solar electricity in some areas of the world, where at some hours of the day we have too much. So like in the middle of the day in Southern California, there's more solar electricity than electricity needs. And so one of the things that, we're really proud that we've gotten to that point, and then every challenge that you overcome creates new challenges on the other side, which, okay, well, now we have this excess. And again, getting to sustainability, how do we harvest that excess and use it in some productive way?
How do you store it? How do you transport it?
How do you store it? Yeah. And how do you store it, transport it, redistribute it, use it, as opposed to just letting it go to waste?
So we're talking about the discoveries in chemistry that have helped make solar energy more efficient, longer lasting, etc. What excites you most about the prospect of accessible and renewable energy?
Well, so the best thing about solar energy is that it's abundant. So most other things we have to worry a lot about scarcity. But with solar energy, there's more than enough to go around. So if we just were able to capture the solar energy that strikes the western half of Massachusetts, which is a small state, that would be enough energy for the entire human race's energy budget. Just that small amount of solar energy. So there's enough. And so that's a wonderful thing to me, because you look at many places and the access to energy really transforms people's lives. It's tough to have a really high quality hospital if there's no electricity. And it's tough to really get people to centers where they can be treated or get supplies or get things they need if they don't have any fuel for their cars or way to get there. And access to energy is the thing that enables that. It really does transform the quality of life, and it really enables the life that we take for granted here in the U.S. When my power's out for a few minutes, I get angry. And so that's the thing that really excites me about getting sort of universal access to abundant renewable energy.
So it's not just sort of our energy becomes a little cheaper or a little more sustainable, which are both wonderful, important things. It's you're actually opening up access to energy to people who don't benefit from that today.
Yeah.
That is a really exciting thing.
Yeah.
So you often talk about how, in lots of contexts, you talk about how your work in the theoretical lab is guided by your Christian faith. Can you share a little bit more in this context on how you see those two working together?
Yeah, because I think that science and faith work together, because science in the end just gives us a sort of a framework for gathering evidence. So we have hypotheses, we test those hypotheses, that leads to conclusions that lead to other hypotheses that lead to more testing, gathering of more evidence. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything about what we do with that evidence. And faith, on the other hand, is a really powerful, religious faith is a really powerful framework for thinking about what we should do, how we ought to live. But it's not very powerful if we don't understand how our actions are going to affect other people and what the outcomes of those actions are going to be. And so I feel like either of those things by itself is kind of lacking something. But when you put those things together, the ability to sort of, in an unbiased fashion, gather and collect and analyze data, and also a framework that says, once we understand that data, well, what do we do? How then should we live? I think is a really powerful worldview that allows us to know how to live.
So in some ways, you describe those different ways of knowing as answering very different questions, right? Your empirical method, answering questions of how the world works, your Christian faith and theological beliefs shaping what to do with that knowledge. Are there ways that you see them actually interacting even more directly?
Yeah, so this is a common way that sometimes people think about science and faith, is that they're sort of these non-overlapping things. One answers these questions, one answers these questions. And I find much more commonly that they actually are different parts of the answer to the same question, which is, if I want to know, whether I should buy an SUV, the answer to that question is, either yes or no, but it takes me knowing, well, what's the fuel economy of that SUV? What are the potential impacts of that? And then how do I weigh that against what my particular moral framework would be in terms of valuing the creation that is around us, valuing people, valuing, what their contributions, to the construction of that vehicle are. Does it matter to me that it's made in America versus made somewhere else? Does it matter to me if this thing is a low emission vehicle? How do I value those things, and why do I place value on those things?
You might have already answered this in pieces, but I'm curious, how does your Christian faith, or how have you seen your Christian faith influence the work you do in the lab, and either the questions you choose to address or how you choose to address them?
Yeah. I think that there is a sense in which, as a Christian who is a scientist, your faith, it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't and it shouldn't influence the way that you answer the questions. One of the tenets of science is we're supposed to be an unbiased observer. And so you answer the question the same whether you're a Christian or not. So, you can be a perfectly good scientist and not a Christian. The thing that Christianity does influence is what questions we might choose to answer. And these are usually driven either by curiosity, so a curiosity about how God might have made something, or why he did it this way, or how he made something work. Or they can be driven sort of more of an ends-based fashion of saying, well, I am driven towards understanding, say, renewable energy, which is, okay, I want to do this for a reason, and that drives the types of questions I ask. And there's, depending on which one of those directions I move, there's a whole swath of questions I just might not bother asking. And that's important because for everyone who does science, we go into it with some kind of inspiration, some kind of intuition about what we really want to find. It may not turn out that way, but we always have to have that drive of, well, I hope it really turns out this way.
Are there areas where you've seen the converse as well, where what you've discovered, or the work you're doing, or what you're learning, or what your colleagues are learning, has that shaped your understanding of God and theology in the world?
Yes, I think so. So, the sort of example that I can think of is that, I've thought a lot about miracles in the Christian faith, for example. And one thing that my investigations through science have led me to think about is, what is the role of these miracle stories? Are they made up? Are they true? If they're true, then what are what are the boundaries on this? How do they work? And one of the things that the scientific method has sort of come in and taught me on this is that, so there's the key tenet of science is reproducibility. That I should be able to do this experiment, repeat that experiment, and get the same result. And of course, most miracles that we can think of are not reproducible. It's what makes them miracles.
But if it's reproducible, it's probably not a miracle.
Yeah. If I could do it again, then it's like, okay, well then there's probably some scientific-ish understanding that I could come up with for that. And so that particular realization that it's like, okay, the thing that I'm thinking of as a miracle, if I'm really looking for some place where God has reached in and done something, that it needs to be something that's not reproducible. And this has been pretty important for me in faith, because there are some people who are out there who will try to convince you otherwise, that miracles are reproducible, that if you do X, Y, and Z, God will do a miracle. And that gives me a pretty powerful way of saying, well, no, that's actually not how God works. That's by definition not miraculous. And so that's been helpful for me in knowing how I can better counsel other Christians and believers.
It's a great example. Building on this, you've written in some contexts and spoken in some contexts on the idea, the interplay between certainty and confidence. So can you define those two concepts?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
How you see them informing your
Yeah.
work and your faith?
Sure. So I think starting around the Enlightenment, people started to view certainty and confidence as sort of existing along one axis. So you'd say, okay, well, I've got an axis, and as I move along this axis, I go from very low confidence over here, and I just increase my confidence, and then certainty is the point at infinity that's all the way out there where I've gotten all the evidence, it all points to the right thing, it all agrees, there's no possible gap, and there's certainty way out there. And this was primarily a philosophical idea. It applied to some extent within mathematics, but then it got transferred over into the physical sciences. So the idea was that, this same picture should apply to everything. And it turns out that idea is pretty useless in the physical sciences, because I can gather lots of evidence about anything I want, but there's always more evidence that I have not yet gathered, or didn't bother to gather, or that the experiment turned out bad and I don't know why.
There's always a black swan somewhere you just haven't seen.
And so there's always this data. Maybe it's all in agreement. Usually it's not all in agreement, but I've got some amount of confidence that I build up based on evidence. But certainty is out there, and I'm never, ever going to get there. And it's not because there's any gap in reality or anything like that. It's just a function of our finiteness as human beings. And so that idea of certainty was just simply not useful in the sciences. And so but at the same time, there is a form of certainty that is useful in life, which is that at some point I've got some amount of evidence, I've got some amount of confidence, and the point at which I have to declare some form of certainty is when I have to make a decision. So if I'm going to get on a plane, I might have some degree of evidence the plane's not going to crash, but if I'm going to get on the plane, I really need to have a different kind of something that says, this plane's really not going to crash. I'm certain, even though I haven't reached that point at infinity where there's no longer any room for doubt, I'm still going to get on the plane, which is a form of certainty. So it's certainty to act. And actually, this is the way that you get from the sort of confidence that you can get to that certainty to act is where the term the leap of faith was actually coined. Was the idea not that there's a gap in our understanding that can never be filled, but there's just always some gap between the knowledge we have now and the decision we might need to immediately make. And getting to that decisive point is accessed through a different kind of knowing, not the sort of scientific evidence gathering, but it builds on the evidence you've gathered and makes a leap to faith.
And so is the idea here that regardless of what we're doing and what we're basing our understanding of the world on, human beings are constantly making leaps of faith, whether we recognize it or not?
Yes, that is absolutely the way that people work. Is that you play, in order to make a decision, in order to do the things that you do, you place your faith in something. And I think Christianity does a good job of laying its cards on the table at the beginning and saying these are the things that we place our faith in. I think if anyone has a worldview where they think they don't place their faith in anything, they are placing their faith, they just don't know it.
Now, are you, somebody watching this might think you're implying that, we're all making leaps of faith all the time. It doesn't really matter what the evidence is. Evidence, we live in a post-fact world, evidence doesn't matter, et cetera. Is that what you're saying?
No, so I would say both science and Christianity would be in agreement that evidence is extremely important.
Yeah.
So from the scientific perspective, it's extremely important because that's the basis of all of our scientific arguments, is sort of empirically drawn evidence. But in Christianity, we would say that evidence is also important because the evidence is there. The evidence that is there was placed by the God who is at that point of infinity of certainty. And so that the evidence should never be in direct contradiction of the conclusion that God wants one to draw.
Given that we're constantly making leaps of faith, whether we recognize it or not, why do some people place more confidence in science than necessarily something transcendent? And why are leaps of faith based on an idea of the transcendent considered foolish?
Right. So it's perfectly natural and right to place more confidence in the observation of science because that's what science gives us. It gives us confidence. It's reproducible. I test things, I repeat the testing, I can gain more confidence. I think the mirage that people, there's this mirage that somehow we're going to build an entire complete worldview out of just those confidence propositions. And to the extent to which one is fooled by that mirage, then it does seem foolish to try to do something else. There's a worldview that says, well, these observations are all there is, and there isn't anything else you can know. But at the same time, it's quite foolish to make all of one's decisions solely based on the existing evidence we have, because the one thing about evidence is that it cuts both ways, which is that we have a certain amount of evidence, and then later on we're going to gather more evidence, and more evidence, and more evidence. And so if we were totally beholden to the evidence, we would have a very, very uncertain existence, because the things that we were certain of and making decisions on would be always open to, oh, that could fall, that could fail, that could fail. And the point that Christian faith makes is that the evidence exists to point to something that extends beyond that evidence, something that transcends the evidence. And that thing is actually more certain than the evidence itself. That the evidence may be unclear, we may not have all the data, we may not be able to interpret all of data or understand all the data, but it's still data that all is intended to point towards something that is immutable, unchanging, and that we can place our certain confidence in.
Thank you.